And we're live. Welcome back to another episode of the Wheelie Podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Atoll, and I'm joined by Electrek's Seth Weintraub, who looks pretty cold over there. How's it going, Seth?
It's going well. I'm in Vermont and my heater's not yet on, so we're dressed appropriately.
Well, we're loving the poof ball hat. But other than the weather, we've got some other cool stories to talk about this week. We've got a bunch of interesting e-bike news, everything from new laws in California that limit throttle use and sort of redefine what makes a legal e-bike, to the return of ONYX, an electric moped company. We recently reviewed a very interesting electric cargo bike from Xtracycle. We saw another case of Russia using electric scooters in their war against Ukraine. And we're going to finish it off with a bit of a weird electric vehicle in the form of a half scooter, half suitcase. But where are we going to start this week, Seth?
All right, starting today, California is coming for your e-bike throttles.
Yeah, so this sounds a little bit sensational, but it's actually pretty accurate. There's a new California law. It was signed into law last year and went into effect on January 1st, a couple of days ago. And it has a number of impacts on electric bicycles. But probably the first one most people are going to feel is how it defines the three-class system in relation to throttles. So as a quick reminder here, most of the US, including California, uses a three-class system for electric bicycles, where class 1 can go up to 20 miles per hour on pedal assist. Class 2 is the same thing, but can have a hand throttle, so you don't actually have to pedal. And then class 3 can go up to 28 miles per hour. And all three are limited to 750 watts. Now, there's been sort of a bit of a gray area before about whether class 3 e-bikes could have a throttle or not. The way most people, and by that I mean most electric bike companies, interpreted the class 3 law was that a class 3 e-bike could have a throttle, but it would have to cut out at 20 miles an hour. So you could throttle up to 20, and then if you wanted to go faster up to 28, you had to pedal, and that would engage the pedal assist. There was debate about whether or not that was 100% kosher based on the law. And so California has redefined the classes to make it clear that that is no longer going to fly. Based on this new law, what they're saying is that for an e-bike to be either a class 1 or a class 3, it cannot have any power without the rider pedaling, which basically means it cannot have a functional throttle. So that old system of companies saying like, yeah, it's a class 2/class 3 e-bike, depending on whether or not you pedal, that's not going to fly anymore in California. From now on, if a company wants to sell an e-bike as a class 3 e-bike, that means it can in no way function without the rider pedaling, meaning you can't have a throttle powering it at all, even just up to 20 miles per hour. There is one small exception in that it can have what's known as like a walk assist throttle. So it can have a throttle or a walk mode that goes up to 3.7 miles per hour, which might sound like a strange number, but it seems like they just stole that from the European regulations, which say you can have a 6 kilometer per hour throttle. And so they just took that and converted it to 3.7 miles per hour. Makes sense because a lot of manufacturers already have that programmed into the software. But that's really only good for like parking situations, or when you're walking the bike and you want to be able to have it walk up a hill next to you, sort of thing. So this is actually going to be pretty impactful because most class 3 e-bikes sold in the United States, probably at least 90%, are this sort of quasi class 2/class 3 situation. If you go to like Electrek or Ride One Up, Aventon, Rad Power Bikes, anyone who makes like an e-bike that can go up to 28, it usually has a throttle because everyone knows that Americans generally don't want to buy an e-bike that doesn't have a throttle. Even if they use pedal assist a lot of the time, so many people say no throttle, no thanks. They want to have the option of using it. And so from now on, this is going to be a bit tricky for e-bike manufacturers. There is one way around this law, which I believe is probably what most e-bike makers are going to do, and it relates to how the bikes are marketed. So basically, you can still have this quasi class 2, class 3 situation. However, you cannot market this as a class 3 bike. So for example, if we take like a Electrek XP, which is one of the probably the best selling electric bike in the US. Right now, it works up to 20 on throttle and up to 28 on pedal assist. Uh, if the company were to say this is just a class 2 e-bike, and then the user was to then change the settings and operate up to 28, technically, Electrek is still in compliance with the law because they didn't call it a class 3. They didn't market it as a class 3. It was sort of um, like a secret menu, sort of like special sauce situation where they didn't say that it was available, and the user just simply opened up the settings. In order for that to work, they have to not market it in any way, shape, or form as being capable of going 28. As soon as it's marketed as being able to do that, it's outside of this new California law. So it's going to be a bit tricky for, I think, a lot of e-bike companies to walk this delicate line because California is such a big market, and they're going to want to make sure they're in compliance, while at the same time, every other state seems to not have such a strict definition for the way these class 3 e-bikes work. As this shakes out over the next few months, it'll be interesting to see how different electric bike manufacturers react to this. What are you thinking about it, Seth?
Well, a couple things. One, California often dictates the way other states go in terms of, in terms of electric vehicles, generally speaking, but in other areas as well. So it wouldn't be surprising for me to see for other states to kind of just jump onto this wording. It is frustrating because I think this is what people want. Like people want the ability to have a throttle when they want a throttle and pedal assist when they want a pedal assist. Me personally, like I actually kind of like class 3 e-bikes that don't use a throttle. Um, I think it's a great way to get some exercise and actually bike. But like I also sometimes on a hill or on at a startup want to get a little extra boost, and the throttle is a nice thing to have. So I get both sides of this. Maybe I don't get both sides. Maybe I don't quite understand what California's rationale is here. Like, what is the big idea? What are they trying to prevent here?
Yeah, it does seem like a little bit of a swing and a miss if their goal is just limiting speed, because this doesn't do anything to limit speed. You can still
Right.
go up to 28 miles per hour. It's just your feet have to be spinning. If the goal is to limit throttles, well, then this doesn't really change anything either, because anyone who buys a class 2 e-bike can still throttle up to 20 miles per hour. The one area this law really changes is that the bikes A cannot be marketed as class 3 and have throttles, and B, they cannot throttle up past 20 miles per hour, which is not common among the major manufacturers, like the Aventins and the Rads and whatnot. Like they comply with the throttle stops at 20, but there are several other manufacturers that have either options for the throttle to power up past 20. Like Super 73, you can unlock it to off-road mode, and then you can throttle up to 28 or higher. And so it definitely rules those out now with this new law. And some e-bikes like the Hey Bike Hauler we recently reviewed, I think that one just right out of the box, it throttles up to 28. Like you don't even have to unlock it or anything. And
Right.
so that would also be outside the confines of this new law. So there are a few bikes that this will impact, but it doesn't necessarily either reduce speeds or reduce the number of throttles just in and of itself.
I guess like the other way manufacturers could go is kind of like Luna cycles, which say on their page like these bikes are not legal anywhere. Like don't put them on a street. And of course people do, and they're quite popular on the street. The Surons and the Telarias, and they're just like wildly illegal, and deal with it. like that kind of thing. Like these are meant for off-road, even though they may have street tires or whatever. But um, that's one other way of saying just like, look, this is illegal. Don't put it on the road. If you put it on the road,
Yeah.
we're not responsible. Like basically take it into your own hands, kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so I don't know. I don't like this at all, really, now that I think about it, because it's kind of clipping something that people like about bikes. And as you mentioned, kind of the way California goes is the way the rest of the rest of the states eventually wind up going. So it's a little bit frustrating to see this, I think. And I think, as you mentioned, in the end, this isn't going to change much. It's just going to change some marketing, and there's going to be some sort of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, kind of stuff. And like I'm sure, the reviewers' guides that we get for bikes are going to be like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is how you get from class 2 to class 3, and oh, and there's a double secret menu to get to throttle up to 35 miles per hour. That kind of thing. So
Yeah, though there's another interesting part of this law. This was actually this bill that was signed last year.
mhm.
It it covers many things. This was a major part of it. It also covers new regulations for like UL certification or like third-party certification stuff that come into play in 2026 and fire safety regulations that come into play in 2028. But there's one other section that relates to both motor power and the intention of e-bike companies for their bikes to be unlocked. And that's actually the next article if you want to go ahead and move to that one, because this was such like a wide encompassing law that I broke this into two different articles here.
All right, well,
And
let's
that's
get
where
into
things
that one.
get even more interesting.
All right, so what's illegal now?
All right, so now if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see there are these three provisions for what makes or what like nullifies an e-bike as an electric bicycle under California law. And to be clear, this is talking about like the legal term electric bicycle. So like we can say I don't know, like a 30-mile-an-hour Super 73, like it's an e-bike, like we can all see that it's a bike and it's an electric, but we're talking about the regulatory legal terminology electric bicycle that allows these things to be ridden without a license and that sort of thing in California. So the first provision is that sort of like we talked about, that it cannot be designed to go over 20 miles an hour on throttle or attain more than 750 watts of power. But the important thing here is that it cannot be designed by the manufacturer to be modifiable to those parameters. So, for example, Super 73, it's designed to be modifiable to those parameters. Like it's meant so that you can easily unlock it into off road mode. Many e bikes have these off road modes, right, that open up all the restrictions. So, as soon as the manufacturer has created this possibility for it to be unlocked, that vehicle is now not considered an electric bicycle under California law, even while it's still in its locked mode,
What if you have
which
to
is
cut
a
like a
big
brown
deal.
wire?
I would call that intended by the manufacturer to be modifiable.
Really,
Like,
cutting
I
a
mean,
brown wire?
well, all right. So that's, yeah. If you have to physically change something, then yeah, you could make the argument, well, you weren't supposed to cut anything, right? Like, that the
I mean,
manufacturer
cutting
never
cutting a
intended for you to
wire. I
cut.
mean, I like we can all wink, wink, nudge, nudge this, but
Yeah.
cutting a wire is like seems like the kind of thing that could get around this law. I
Yeah.
don't know the words, but like cutting a wire is a kind of like physical modification to a bike that I feel like they've done enough in this case.
Yeah, so that we'll get to in the
Oh,
second
good.
provision. So that would be argued in court, right? Like whether or not that wire being there was intended to make it modifiable. I could see the argument going either way there. Like I can certainly play devil's advocate. Um, Based on the second provision, even if the wire is considered okay, as soon as you've cut that to modify it to go greater than 20 on throttle, that's no longer an electric bicycle under California law. So it would be nullified by the second one. Whether or not you could ride it as an electric bicycle in its uncut state would depend on the argument there.
But
And
now
the third,
we've
yeah,
now we've now moved the problem over to the rider, not the manufacturer.
Right.
Okay.
Right. The third provision is I think one that pretty much everyone accepts. Like as soon as you take the pedals off, it's not a bicycle anymore. You know, now it's basically a moped or a motorbike. But the other thing that I think is important here is that in both the first and second provision, it says that it cannot attain a power rating of over 750 watts, and most importantly, they removed the phrase continuous power, which used to be part of all of these laws. And that's pretty important because almost every 750 watt motor that's labeled 750 watts peaks at well over that. You know, we're talking 900, 1,000. You know, Electrik's is like 1,300. We've seen 1,400 watt motors that are nominally called 750 watt motors. So by removing the term continuous power and putting just 750 watts, that likely indicates peak wattage, which is depends how, like, are we going to bring in physicists to argue in court like the difference between continuous and peak power? If we
Right.
are
And how are they
talking
going to
peak
measure it?
power,
Are they going to put it on a dyno, or are they going to look at
so and that's
the
yeah, well, that's the thing is you could, if you put these bikes on a dyno, you could very easily see that a 750 watt e-bike puts out well over 750 watts. And so, you know, if that was done, it would be quite apparent that most of the 750 watt e-bikes currently sold in the US would find themselves outside the confines of this law. They would not be considered electric bicycles under this new California law that began being enforceable 2 days ago, which could be a very big issue depending how, you know, if courts get involved, how they interpret this law. That's one that's going to be very interesting to watch play out because it will have a major impact on the current types of electric bicycles. Now, in practice, it would probably mean that all the companies moved to referring to their motors as 750 watts and they stop advertising the peak power, which would be very similar to the way it works in Europe, which is that, you know, every Bosch mid-drive puts out more than 250 watts. Like no one is under any, you know, misunderstanding here, right? Like we all know these are more than 250 watts. They often are dyno tested at like, you know, 600, 700 watts for like most of these Bosch motors, but they all have 250 watt stickers to comply with European law because European law does not have this continuous power provision like US law normally has. And so now if California is going to push towards this non-continuous rating, meaning basically peak rating, manufacturers are going to have to start doing this, you know, finger quote 750 watt situation and not advertise peak power anymore. In practice, that's pretty easy to do. Probably manufacturers will move to publishing torque numbers, which many of them already do. That's basically how it's done in Europe to indicate how powerful a motor really is they advertise their torque figures because they can't advertise a number bigger than 250 watts. So I can see that becoming more common in the US.
Yeah, I don't know how California kind of figures out. I mean, scientifically they could go into the controller, you know, put full throttle down or put, you know, full pedal down and see like how much electricity is coming out, like how many volts, how many amps, you know, that's how many watts. And I can pretty much guarantee that there's not a controller on the market that would just stop at 750 watts. I mean,
Yeah.
they could almost like they could make a compliance for controllers that says they stop at 750 watts. So that's the only way I could see like actually getting this to be sorted out. And I don't think that they would do that. I don't even think they would even come up with the idea to do that. So yeah, this is kind of weird. Like you know, California is usually kind of a leader in forward thinking on electric vehicles, and this kind of seems like a big step back. You know, I do understand where they're coming from, like, you know, with these and I also don't want to like put it all on Super 73, although that company is kind of the the company that stands out in most people's minds at like what's wrong with the e-bike industry with, you know, their kids that are like 12 years old riding around 35 mile per hour mopeds basically in packs, you know. This is obviously what's getting the attention of the lawmakers. So I get it, but I don't know that this is the right way to go about it. I think there's probably better ways, or maybe like, hey, let's embrace it. Let's say, all right, you want fast bikes, let's build some infrastructure so that you don't have to get in the way of cars, and you don't have to um, the danger is not there as well. Like, I think they're trying to protect some of the riders. And I've mentioned this before. We review a lot of bikes. I feel a lot safer sometimes on bikes that can go over 30 miles per hour, because I'm on a street that cars are going 30 miles per hour, and I can ride with traffic rather than having traffic having to like go around me and um, you know shake their fist at me. So I don't know that this is going to have the right result overall. But I don't know what the right result or the right idea is either. So I guess we'll have to keep an eye on how things shake out here.
Yeah, this is going to be a fascinating one to watch in 2025.
Well, speaking of overpowered e-bikes, let's move on to retro-themed electric moped brand ONYX returns with 55-mile-per-hour bikes.
Yeah, ONYX is back. We covered last year how ONYX went into, I'm not sure if it was technically bankruptcy or receivership, but basically they ceased operations. It was actually a pretty sad story. So ONYX, they've made really cool retro-themed electric mopeds since 2018. I think I was one of the ones to break the story when they launched, because there were very few people even talking about this company, and they became super popular. They were basically the only U.S. based U.S. manufacturing for electric mopeds. But unfortunately, the company's owner, who was the sole owner, passed away. He was only like 37, and so a pretty young guy, and he didn't have a will, there was no like plan of action, and so all the company's debt became a major issue. The creditors were all fighting over the assets of the company. The ONYX was in a decent amount of debt by that point, and so things fell apart earlier this year. Now, fortunately, we're learning that's not the final chapter for ONYX. The company's original founder, who had sold it to the former owner, has revived ONYX. That's Tim Seward. He's brought the brand back, and they've relaunched with 100 RCR limited bikes. So this is basically the same model that they've had for several years, with all of the more recent improvements, the bigger battery, some nice electronic improvements. I believe the BMS is Bluetooth, so you can monitor it from your phone for the battery. These are $4,300 to get one of 100, like custom numbered. I think they come with like holographic stickers marking these as like the relaunched bikes. And then they plan to have new production models in the US sometime this coming spring. So maybe like March, April-ish. We're going to be looking at a full supply of ready to go production bikes, which is good because from what I understand, these first 100 almost completely sold out right when the company announced that they were coming back. There was a lot of pent up demand for these things. It's just this really cool combination of like, old school 80s retro design with modern day electric bike components. Like we said, this is not an e-bike or an electric bicycle. Legally speaking, this is a motorbike or moped class vehicle, depending on the state that you're in. At 55 miles per hour, this is probably going to fit into motorcycle regulations in most states, though I believe that in some states you can fit it into moped class registration, which is usually a little bit easier than full motorcycles. Fewer regulations, lower registration costs, that sort of thing. And we have seen plenty of people get these things plated. Most of the time, I don't think people are going through the process of registering these, but we've seen it done successfully. So this is something that, if you are looking for an ONYX now, it would be a good idea to go the right way and get it plated. But we've seen people riding these all over the place, basically treating them as like something in between an electric bike and an electric motorcycle. It does have functional pedals. I don't think it'd be very comfortable to pedal a 150-pound bike if the battery ever dies. But it does fit moped definitions in many places. What do you think, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I love the bike. Actually, a friend and neighbor of mine has one of these, and I got to ride it around a little bit. It's quite a bit of fun. Obviously, not street legal unless you get it plated. Um, they actually go over 55 miles per hour. I don't remember it being that quite that fast, but it sounds right, I
Yeah,
guess.
they used to advertise them as 60, but I think a lot of people are complaining that they only got up to like the low to mid 50s. So they seem to have changed the marketing to reflect that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a great e-bike. I think he might have had some problems with his. And when a company goes bankrupt, it's a little bit harder to find parts and replacement and repairs. But you know, overall, it's a great looking bike. I know a lot of people would send me, they would see something on Instagram or something about it, and they'd be like, "Oh, you should check out this e-bike." I'd be like, "Yes, we've covered it." Like many times, it was one of those things that I would send back our link to the coverage of it. So it's one of those things that it gets a lot of attention, and I'm glad the company's back in action. But I don't know that like this is like going to go mainstream, both because of the legality issues, but also because um, you know it's not necessarily something that can scale really. Like it seems like a smaller operation, especially at this point without the founder. So I mean, best wishes to them. I think they made a really awesome product, but we'll still have to see if this is going to like get off the ground again.
Yeah.
I don't know that it will. What do you think?
Well, at the time that the company sort of fell apart after the owner's passing, it was moving towards Chinese manufacturing. So they had been building them in. They had one factory near San Francisco and another in just outside of LA. And I think that was incredibly expensive. It was a nice idea. They were able to, like monitor production very well, but I think it was too costly. And so they had been moving towards Chinese manufacturing. That was actually one of the problems was that there were like 100 or more bikes, held up at this Chinese manufacturer that they couldn't get after James passed away, and the manufacturer was waiting to get paid. There was no money to pay them. They were one of the creditors at that point. And so, if things have been worked out with the Chinese manufacturer, then perhaps there is room to scale this. Obviously, they'll have lower manufacturing costs than when they were trying to do this all in the US. And I mean, to be honest, most of these parts are probably coming from China anyways, certainly mostly
Or
from Asia, even if, brakes and tires come from some other Asian countries. So it just kind of makes sense to keep all the production there. Of course, then you've got tariff issues that may be coming up in a few weeks, which is going to be its own interesting world. Maybe we'll be covering that on the next podcast.
yeah.
So I don't know. There may be room to run here. It's I think it's a little early to see. Also, the legal battles aren't over. There are still people fighting over ONYX's assets. So there's a lot left to be figured out here before we determine if this is going to be a sink or swim situation for ONYX now on the second try.
All right, we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Well, looks like we lost Seth there at the end, but yeah, this is absolutely going to be an interesting one as we see ONYX expand, and especially with ONYX bringing more production bikes to the market in this coming spring. It'll be interesting to see how they sort of roll out and continue back into normal operations for ONYX.
All right. Next story is Xtracycle Hopper review, a better cargo e-bike at a better price.
This was a really fun one to review. Xtracycle, they didn't invent the long tail cargo bike, but they probably are responsible for making it as popular as it is. I think the actual invention goes back like to early 1900s, but they were the ones that first came out with a kit to turn normal bicycles into long tail cargo bikes by bolting on an extended rear end. And then they came out with several of their own purpose-built long-tail cargo bikes, and that's when manufacturers started producing this style of cargo bike. So from this company that got started in California in the 90s, they've gone through several different renditions, and this is their latest, the Xtracycle Hopper. And this one is actually technically not even a long-tail cargo bike. It's what many people call a mid-tail. It's actually more compact than most of their long-tail cargo bikes, but it can still carry up to 500 pounds of cargo. You can fit 2 kids on the back, no problem. If you're watching this here, a friend of mine is putting his son on the back, and then he also puts the stroller behind his son's, like I guess it's not a car seat, but those like safety seats you put on bikes. So you can carry cargo and passengers at the same time. This is very much a heavy hauling cargo e-bike, but it's shorter than a lot of long tail bikes, and it definitely rides more like a normal bike than the really long stretched out long tail cargo bikes. Xtracycle is also, closer to what we often call bike shop brands. Bicycle companies that come from a more traditional cycling background. So they're going to be using higher end components. The bicycle frames go through a much more conventional, traditional design process. So they're designed with proper geometry compared to a lot of these e-bike startups that sort of, they create the general shape of a bicycle frame, but some of the nuance is lost, which can lead to funky handling. So Xtracycle is very much a traditional bike shop brand type company. And that's evident on a lot of the parts here. If you're watching the podcast video with us, you might have seen that they've got that dropper post on there, which means that with a push of a button, the saddle can move up and down. You generally find that on nicer mountain bikes because it's really convenient when you're going to be going over bumps and that sort of thing, that you can drop the seat out of the way. But on a cargo bike, it's also a really nice feature to have so that while you're pedaling, you're up higher, but when you come to a stop and you're trying to hold all that cargo up and down, you can drop the seat down and make it easier to get on and off. Another nice thing about the Xtracycle Hopper here is that it comes with all of that cargo gear. It comes with the front rack, with the rear rack, the rear running boards for feet, that kid cage on the back. I think it's called the hoopty. I call it the kid cage. And so, these aren't like add-ons that most cargo bike companies charge hundreds of dollars to get. You get the cargo gear with it. It's priced at $29.99, so you're talking about a $3,000 bike here. The downside, I would say, is that it is a rear hub motor, so that's closer to some of the more entry level cargo bikes, the Rad Wagons, the Electrek Expeditions, the Aventina Bound, these kind of like budget priced bikes. But other than the hub motor and the sort of like basic Shimano derailleur, it's got a bunch of other higher end parts. It's got that really nice torque sensor. It's got a much higher weight rating. It's got a very nice handling to it. You can just tell when you ride it that it's designed with proper bike geometry, integrated lights, so you're not getting wires and cables caught on the lights at bike rats, that sort of thing. A cargo rated fork, which a lot of cargo bikes either have a rigid fork or they just have some like generic sort of like cheap mountain bike style fork. This one's actually rated for cargo loads, which is part of how the bike can get up to 500 pounds of cargo capacity. So just like a really nice higher end cargo bike at what is sort of a mid-range price, $3,000. It's certainly more affordable than the Urban Arrows, the Recent Molars, the Turns, that sort of thing. Though it's not really in the same class as those. I call it kind of like the Goldilocks cargo bike because it fits between the budget entry level models and the really nice $5,000-$6,000 high end models. To me, this is like the kind of person that wants to spend a little bit more because they're putting their kids on the bike and they want to not get the super budget cargo bike, but they're not about to spend $6,000 on any bike either. This is kind of the bike for them, in my opinion. You've been on a few cargo bikes though, Seth. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it looks like a solid choice here. And as you mentioned, the rear hub motor would probably be the one thing that, um, causes some pause. That said, rear hub motors do offer some advantages. Like if you break your chain, and theoretically you still have a throttle, you can still get around. Whereas a mid drive, if you break your chain, you're pretty much done for the day.
Yeah.
So, there's the give and take of rear hub and that's probably for a different video or a different conversation. But it is nice to see an option like this for families. And I noticed that your nephew and nieces are getting a little bit bigger, so it looks like these bikes are growing to kind of handle the larger relatives. So that's nice to see. And I also see that in this particular picture, you've got quite a big packed thing. This would be good for grocery getting, obviously, and like the SUV of biking as well. So great to see another great option in the, as you mentioned, the Goldilocks category. So you love to see it.
We lost Seth again. I'm guessing he'll be back in a few seconds. But there's one thing I forgot to mention, which is, to me, one sort of slight downside on this bike. And I would say the one downside to the Hopper that I really felt was that the throttle is one of those, it only engages when you're moving at like 2 miles an hour or faster. So you can't throttle from zero. I really like the kind of bikes when you can throttle from zero, just in case you want to use it to get rolling, or you're starting at the bottom of a hill. The bottom of the hill thing is kind of like a niche scenario we often talk about, like, what if I'm stopped at the bottom of the hill? But it does occasionally happen, and it's nice to be able to throttle from zero. So it would have been nice if they had given this bike throttle from zero ability, though I do know that some companies don't, just because it extends the lifespan of the drivetrain. It's a lot less stress if it engages while it's slowly rolling versus engaging from a stop. So perhaps that's why they went with it here. But that's sort of like the one thing that I wish I could change, would be to just change the firmware so you can throttle from zero on the Hopper.
Yeah, that's a nice addition to have. Let's move on. Russian soldiers are turning to electric scooters in failed assaults against Ukraine.
This is wild. I did not expect to be covering this news. But basically, yeah, it's right there in the headline. Russians are, I guess they lost so many tanks and APCs that soldiers are literally riding into battle on standing electric scooters. It sounds like satire, but this is happening. Like in this article, there's a drone video of these Russian soldiers riding in on electric scooters. These look like pretty basic Chinese, off-road scooters. They're also soldiers on like ATVs and what look like glorified golf carts and such. But these particular soldiers, it's interesting because you can see them like riding down roads. They'll actually carry the scooters over these like cratered roads that have probably been, hit several times by mortars and other fire. And so these are what appear to be pretty effective vehicles. And there's an interview in the article that I think it's a lieutenant colonel in the Ukrainian forces was interviewed by the New York Times, and what he said was that they've noticed the Russians using more of these distributed micromobility vehicles, because before, if they had 15 Russian soldiers, all in an APC, the Ukrainians could hit that with one drone or one missile and take out all 15 soldiers. Now he's saying when they're 15 soldiers each on their own scooter, it's a lot harder to take those out. So I think the Russians have discovered this partly as a new tactic to be able to sort of distribute their soldiers, but partly because I think they've just lost so much war material that they're kind of having to, by necessity, use these strange civilian vehicles like golf carts and electric scooters. But it's a strange thing to, in 2025 now, be talking about militarized scooters. And this isn't even the first case of militarized scooters. Just a few weeks ago, we covered an electric scooter was used in an assassination of a Russian general. That time it seemed that the scooter had been loaded with explosives. The Ukrainian intelligence services took credit for that assassination. And basically it was like a super targeted hit on a Russian nuclear forces general. But the Ukrainians have long adopted micromobility. I mean, they've been using those Delfast bikes that we've talked about before to carry the NLAW rockets. They've been using high power electric bicycles for their sniper teams. They've used electric kayaks like they're sort of all in on various forms of electric micromobility. So they've sort of adopted it from the beginning, and the Russians have over time, it seems, out of necessity, sort of been coming around to micromobility. But from everything we're seeing, the Ukrainians have used it much more successfully than the Russians have, because as we saw in this instance, even these soldiers on electric scooters, it was not that difficult for the Ukrainians to take them out. Just slightly more of an operation than when the soldiers are bunched together. So very, I mean, it's fascinating to see, but it's just a terrible use case that this has to be happening, and that, this many years into this war, that this is still happening.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, especially, when we reviewed a few of the like higher powered electric scooters, that they would be used as war machines. And you can even see like, all right, so they're using that stuff. Like eventually there'll probably be autonomous scooters. And we should mention, for those not watching, um, that we're talking about the kick scooters, not necessarily like a Vespa type scooter. So these are like, bird scooters, obviously a little bit more burly than what you would find on the streets of, Frankfurt or something, but still, like, people are riding around on scooters, like with, full military regalia and like weapons into battle. It's just a kind of a wild scene. And it's like baffling to me, like the reason that they're doing this is so that they're more distributed, so that that they're not necessarily harder to take out, but it's harder to take out every single one of them. Instead of dropping one, drone bomb, they have to do 15 or something. So it's just wild, like that this is where we are in the world today.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there. I don't know if there is a silver lining here. But we'll just leave it at that. How about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. We'll finish it up with a more light story. You bought a weird motorized suitcase in China and rode it home. Here's what happened. And I would like to note that this is a weird Alibaba thing. And I think I speak for many of your readers when we were happy to see this make a return, and hope to see more.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is like actually a follow-up to Weird Alibaba. When I chose for my last Weird Alibaba article an electric suitcase scooter, I did it sort of with the ulterior motive of knowing that I would be reviewing one very soon. And so this follows up sort of the um, hypothetical, like tongue-in-cheek reviews I do of Alibaba products. And this one I actually got. So I was recently in China for a little over a week, touring several more electric bike and scooter and golf cart factories. Those articles and videos are going to be coming soon, so be on the watch for those. But before I left the country, on the last day, I was in the Shanghai airport, and I found this suitcase in one of these, like, sort of the Chinese version of Hudson News or whatever in the airport. And I'd actually been looking for one all week, because here in the West they cost like $900,000. It's crazy. It's like a little carry-on rollerboard suitcase that functions like a scooter. And I would never spend that much because it's just dumb. But in China, I found it priced at 3,000 won, which is like $410. And for that, I can
Let's do it.
just about justify it. Yeah. That's a business expense. so,
Yep.
um, so I actually got one, and I made the sales girl's day, and I wrote it out of the Chinese version of Hudson News, and I had 3 airports to test it in. So started in Shanghai, wrote it all over the airport, had several hours to kill. It is super, super fun. It you feel kind of self-conscious riding around because everyone's looking at you zip by on a suitcase, and you just feel so dumb, especially like people are literally laughing out loud as you go by. Though that might have been the selfie stick I was also holding. But it's super fun, and like it's way faster than walking. So rode it all over Shanghai. I took my flight to my connection in Abu Dhabi. Once I got to Abu Dhabi, I had several more hours to kill, so I downloaded the smartphone app that comes with this suitcase. one of the few suitcases that has an app. And I found that the whole time I was testing in Shanghai, I was only in the middle gear. There was a high gear. So immediately I, unlocked it, put it into high gear. Now there's like my hair is like, flowing in the wind. It goes 8 miles an hour in its highest gear, which does not sound that fast until you're like almost causing a pile up in an airport. And then you realize how fast 8 miles an hour for a suitcase is. It'll like throw you off in the turns because it's a tricycle. So you really got to like take the turns easy or put your feet out to like slide across the linoleum if you're taking fast turns. Um, and then in Abu Dhabi, I actually was worried because when I went through the next security line to board my next flight, it got pulled off into that like second row of shame of all the bags that have to get checked by the TSA
Yep.
or whatever the Emirates version of TSA is,
What
which
was
is
the
like a
problem?
dude in military fatigues. So they took it over to the TV and like looked at the X-ray and were like, all right, it's fine, and didn't even open it.
Hmm.
So I don't know what caused it to get pulled off. I had the battery out of it. The battery comes out, like an e-bike, and so the battery was already out of it. But apparently they just had to like look at it on the X-ray a second time, and they didn't even care. They said it was fine. So apparently it makes it through security just fine. It does have a 92 watt hour battery, which is important because most airlines have a 100 watt hour limit. So it is legal to carry on as a sub 100 watt hour battery for almost every international airline. Um, it fit in the overhead compartments. I had it on two different planes. When I got back to Tel Aviv, I rode it out of the airport. I took a train to the closest station to my apartment. So I had like 2 kilometers or like 1.2 miles to go. I rode it part of the way to my apartment, but like on the road, it's just so slow at 8 miles an hour that I put it on a Lime scooter and just stood on it and then rode the rest of the way on a Lime scooter to get home faster. But the summary is that it actually worked really, really well for zipping through an airport. Like if you're in some of these like huge airports where it can really be like a 15 or 20-minute walk to like go from one connection to another, and you're in like a tight time crunch, I could see it being useful. Um, you do feel kind of silly. The other case I can see it being useful for are older folks or people that like walking 20 minutes is difficult for them. Maybe they've got mobility issues, joints, that sort of thing. And so it is kind of neat that like you already have to have a suitcase with you. Like wouldn't it be nice if you could just ride that suitcase around, especially if it's a carry-on, so like you have it even when your checked bag is not with you, when you're making those connections. So I see the point. For someone like me, like I would never really use this afterwards. I'm not a roller bag fan to begin with because like anytime the escalators were out, like you got to carry this heavy bag, up and down the stairs. I'm a backpack guy. Like it just becomes part of you, and then you don't have to like you forget that it's there. So I hate roller bags just because it's a chore. But I can see the use in terms of pricing. It doesn't quite make sense to me. I would never pay 900, $1,000 for this on Amazon. I Even at like the 400, I wouldn't have gotten it for myself if I wasn't like an electric mobility journalist and it was my job to test these things or test these things with finger quotes.
Yep.
So it's hard for me to tell anyone like, yeah, this is definitely a buy outside of those few niche cases where like you need the extra mobility or like you frequently find yourself covering very long distances. I've since heard from multiple people that have said like I see these often used in like trade shows or like like maybe at like Eurobike where you've got these huge conference halls that you're trying to get around. Apparently these are very common in China for those things. So there are cases where I could see it making sense, but this is very like a very niche thing that I don't think most people are gonna want to deal with outside of you know those specific uses in an airport.
I mean, what if you're mobily challenged? I guess the terminology, maybe you can get around, but after a certain amount of steps, you're starting to have some issues. Maybe you're in the older, like, would this actually benefit people, or is this kind of just a gimmick? Like, can you see this, say I'm 80 years old, I can walk a little bit, but I can't, like, this maybe isn't the right tool for that situation. What do you think?
So it certainly could be. The one downside there is that the bag itself weighs like 22 pounds or about 10 kilos. So it's hard for me to think of like the frail person that needs this to walk, but that can also lift it over their heads into the overhead bin, right? So like
Yeah,
if someone, let's say like a husband and wife situation, or just like people traveling with others, if
right,
there's like a healthy one that can lift something, and then the person who has mobility issues, they just can't walk for 20-25 minutes straight, it would be a great thing for them to use, and then they can get some help lifting it. But if you're by yourself like I was, like it's hard for me to imagine being immobile and also capable of carrying this thing when necessary.
right. And so, like, if you had a broken foot, for instance, with this, like, I mean, I guess you could lift it
Yeah, in
temporarily
that
on one
case.
foot, but if rather than walking around with crutches, maybe this is a little bit better. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just
And
trying to make a case for it in that.
yeah, well, there's a fair case to be made in that situation. Like there are people this would certainly help, and even for like able-bodied people. I mean, on cases where like the Shanghai airport is huge, like it was really like a 20-minute walk from point to point, and I'd get there in like 7 minutes. So like it was super nice. Like it feels like a life hack. Like places where you normally would just have to like you know take a slog and just walk for a third of an hour. You're just zipping along on your own go-kart. So
Right.
it is really nice for making the shortcut,
And
but
then what is the
like
range,
at
I
what
guess?
cost?
Yeah, what is the range on
I
this?
I think they said it was something like 8 miles or 13 kilometers, something like crazy longer than you would ever need.
And then you can charge it up with USB-C, I'm hoping.
Unfortunately, no. It does have a USB outlet on USB A, but it's only an outlet, for like charging your phone. You do need. It's got like a barrel plug, like we were talking about for the e-bike chargers. So
Right,
you do need like a sort of an e-bike style charger. It is pretty small. It's smaller than it's probably a third of the size of a normal e-bike
right.
charger. And it is 36 volts, by the way, which is pretty common e-bike voltage. But
Yep.
unfortunately, you can't charge on USB-C. That would have been perfect.
All right. Well, we'll have to wait for the next version of that to get the perfect solution. Let's hit the comments real quick. Scott Richards knew this would happen. We're talking about the California laws. Soon, most of USA will follow, and then with the throttle, we'll need registration. No worries for my Class 1 Gazelle. And I've reached 39 miles per hour on smooth roads, 20, not 27 on level section. Um,
Wow.
I imagine 39 is going downhill. Um, I don't think you're pedaling up to 39 miles per hour on a Gazelle, and it sounds like the 27 on a level section is something that a Class 3 e-bike would do pretty commonly. What's the fastest you've ever gone on a Bosch e-bike?
Um, Downhill, probably close to that, but at that point, like it's just gravity, right?
Yeah,
Like it's
I
just
did.
it's just a measure of the angle and the weight of the bike and rider.
Yeah, I got a recent Mueller uh, bike up to 50 miles per hour on this hill near me. It was quite scary, but it was nice to have, the Bosch will have the max speed. So definitely hung that on my wall of fame here. Hausman says it's amazing how dirt bikes are really overtaking the scene. Never saw that coming. I think the dirt bikes are taking over the scene because they are unbridled and they don't have any, limits. So people are like, well, what's the fastest bike I can get? And there's no like certification process happening. Um, I mean, what do you like in Tel Aviv where it's way more stringent? You don't see a bunch of like Super 73 type bikes running around, right?
You don't see a lot of Super 73s, though just in the last few months, I've seen multiple Surons. I don't know
Really?
how they, yeah, I mean, they're not plated, like they're just riding around illegally, like most people do, like as you do with a Suron. Um,
Right.
and And yeah, so it's actually started to like pop up here where most of the bikes are these like, standard class 2 folding e-bikes where technically even we use the European limit, so it's 25 kilometers per hour, 15 miles per hour. Though a lot of people's e-bikes go faster. They probably just get like the US firmware.
And they're just waiting to get arrested, or thinking
I
that that
mean,
will outrun the cops, or what's the plan there?
the the cops don't really care if you're going like, I mean, the difference between 15 and 20, like they probably don't even notice it, right? So
Mhm.
if you're doing 20 miles an hour, no cop's going to give you a problem. The e-bikes that they were pulling over for a while were the like DIY custom builds with the
Got it.
massive 2000-watt motors, because those they could just look at and see that it was not legal. Like it's obvious
I
it's not a
mean,
250-watt motor.
but looking at a Suron, there's no question that
Oh,
there's no
those,
legality.
yeah. Those though, so Tel Aviv's traffic looks a lot like New York or other big cities where, like if you're on a Sauron and the cops turn on their lights, like suddenly you're not in their picture anymore, like
Right,
10 seconds later. So I think
right.
most people just run in that situation.
Interesting.
Yeah. Like unless the cop's on a motorcycle there, and even then, like they probably won't fit in the places that a Sauron fits.
Right. All right. Governments want the roads for the delivery trucks moving goods. They trick everyone else to pay for their deliveries once transport of goods isn't rigged against the public to fill pockets of the rich. All right, and kind of a little bit of a conspiracy going on. Better modes of transport can be built and used. The city I live in Canada has the mobility scooters in stores, almost all removed from the last few years. They keep being stolen. Electric scooters for shoppers are still around, but not much. All right, we got kind of a thing going here. Let's just move through this. I've seen last year scooters being driven. 7-Eleven. All right. And e-bikes going slower than someone can run is insane to me. Anything over 50 kilometers per hour should require a strong bike, though. Yeah, I guess it's what is the sweet spot in between that people are going to be accepting about, but actually provide some value to the riders? I think that's the big question overall.
Yeah. And I think the US with like the 20 and the 28, I think both of those are reasonable numbers for different scenarios. So
Yep.
I think that's a lot nicer than the European 15, if you ask me, because 15, like, just pedal at that point. Like, what's the point of having the assist other than hills, I guess?
Yep.
All
All right.
right. Well,
That's
I think that's all of the comments. So thank you guys all for tuning in, and we will catch you guys back here in another 2 weeks for the next episode of the Wheelie Pod.